Good evening and welcome to tonight's Darkwood Brew. I'm Chris Alexander, your host for tonight. And Darkwood Brew is where we blend ancient Christian mystical practices with internet technology that's state of the art, along with the arts, along with classical jazz, and well, you just never know what's going to happen on Darkwood Brew. So we welcome you tonight to be with us as we look to the psalmist tonight to talk to us about the assurance of God in our lives and how God calls us forward into active and abundant living, moving, growing, changing, and learning as we go, always assured that God is with us in our journey. Tonight to talk to us about this message from the psalmist from Psalm 23 will be Reverend Cecil Prescod. He is a United Church of Christ pastor from Ainsworth, United Church of Christ in Portland, Oregon. He is an avid Darkwood brewer, so many of you brewers online might recognize the name as someone who joins us on chat quite frequently. And he's here to tell us not only about his interpretation of how the psalmist calls us into living rather than just comforting us in our dying in this text, but also to share with us some of his experiences in social injustice advocacy, as well as continuing the civil rights movements that continues to be needed even in today's time, and the assurance of God in the midst of that advocacy. So we welcome Cecil to be with us tonight. Tonight, Eric Elness will not be our host as regularly planned because he is on vacation with his family this week, and quite lucky for us, where he's vacationing is Portland, Oregon. So, directly where our Skype guest is, we hope, and we've heard rumors, that Eric might join us and pop in a little bit to join our conversation tonight from Portland with Cecil. So we'll have to wait and see if anything pops up there for Eric to join us. And I'd like to take this time to shout out a little bit of a thank you to Reverend Dr. Scott Frederickson, who is with us tonight as our guest chat administrator. So for those of you who are used to talking to me online, you get a chance to talk to Scott Frederickson tonight. And he might be using my name, right?
I am using it.
Yeah, he's using my name.
Quite liberally.
But so say hi to him and say thank you for being with us tonight as our chat administrator. And we'll be right back with our Pneuma text, Psalm 23. So grab a Bible. And right after we see what more has happened in our series thus far.
I've been keeping track of the amount of silence in silent prayer of all the churches I've been to in the last 15 years. You know what the average amount of silence in silent prayer is?
2.5 seconds.
Almost 9 seconds.
Let's be honest, folks, it's not practice, it's discipline, and none of us like discipline, you know? And so I think that's why we tend to shy away from adopting contemplative practice, because it feels like discipline, it doesn't feel like prayer. Why contemplative practice is so important is so that in our active life, that connection to the source, to our Creator, to all of that goodness and love and mercy can naturally come through.
myself of a young man with Down syndrome. Every day when I pick up my daughter from school, they let the other children with special needs out first. And he has this amazing smile on his face, and he just skips out of there so happy. And I know from my daughter that he spends this day in hell. And he's bullied and he's picked on, but yet he has this irrepressible smile that cannot be stopped. Every time I see that smile, it recalibrates me, and it reminds me that I need to stop and see the world through his eyes, because his eyes are the eyes of our unhurried God.
An amazing story from all of our folks who were with us at Wild Goose Festival. We have several shout outs that are really mindful of this busyness of God, of this busyness that distracts us from always listening to God. And so we're going to take some time in this Numa Divina to listen to our text, Psalm 23, and notice for you during this very first reading, overall, what is the message that is trying to be given to you by our psalmist? Don't necessarily think for significance or specific words or anything at this point. Just think to the overall text. What is it saying? Numa Divina is an ancient practice that we use here at Darkwood Brew. It was originally called Lectio Divina, and we're using it to help us open our hearts and our minds as we listen to the voice of God in our lives. So we ask if you will please just take a deep breath, let it out, and let go of anything that might be standing in the way of you listening to the voice of God through the text tonight. Breathe deep and listen for the meaning of the message as we read Psalm 23.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long.
As you continue to dwell on this text, we hope that you will listen to the voice of God, helping you think through and maybe ask a question of yourself in the midst of this as you're listening and engaging with the text as we go. So often in Psalm 23, we hear this particular psalm at funerals, and we always think about it as a way of comforting us in death, in the face of death. But in fact, what we're going to talk about tonight, I hope, with Cecil, is to talk about how this psalm is used to call us into living, into a vigorous living of abundance, with the assurance of God to be with us in our journey. In fact, to point that out, we'd asked the question this week of our social media group to concentrate on that exact point of setting a table in front of our enemies. The question of the week was, what does it mean to have a table set before you in the presence of your enemies? We had several different responses from different folks. Maureen Howland joined us and said, hospitality. And it means that your quarrels must be left at the door, along with your sword. This table in the presence of our enemies is something that is used to cross the boundaries, cross the divide of what our differences are, and necessarily call us into the fullness of who we are as humanity, our common humanity, and helps us cross that divide. I think Maureen does a very good job of speaking to that in this idea of hospitality, about leaving your sword at the door and entering into what is most common to us in our humanity. Rachel Keefe answers, I'm not entirely sure, but I think we need a few of these tables. In Israel, in Afghanistan, in Syria. If we share a table, a meal with enemies, are they still enemies after the bread has been broken? It's a good question to ask. And especially as we're dealing with all these international conversations and international relationships, where do we stand on these issues, and how are we called by God to enter into these discussions with foreign policy issues, with civil rights issues? Where are we called to be in this conversation? And lastly, Helen A. Swartert says, we may be at odds, but I choose to engage with you as Jesus taught. Therefore, I offer you to sit with me as an equal, in hopes that we might find peace or reconciliation. The choice to join me is yours. This table in the presence of our enemies also includes those who consider us their enemies. So how do they engage with us in our common humanity at the same time? How do we open that conversation by sitting down at the table, leaving our swords behind, and recognizing that we are both children of God, struggling, trying to find peace in the midst of the chaos and in the struggle? How do we go about opening these conversations? Hospitality at a table is a great way to start. These questions from all of our folks on our social media is an ongoing discussion that happens throughout the week. If you'd like to get on our Facebook pages or on our blogs, there's plenty of opportunity for you to enter this conversation and give us your opinions on what you think that this psalm is calling us into a way of living and being in the world. Now we have a chance to come back and talk to Cecil Prescod about this particular psalm and how he considers this a calling into his life. Just after we talked with Matt and the band, and you can give us an idea who's playing with us tonight, Matt, and what you're playing?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we're going to do a couple of Chuck Moronic tunes a little later in the episode. The feature will be called Time Essence, and communion will be Justice for the Earth. Joining us on the piano tonight, Matt Amandus, Bobo Bennett on the drums, and Clark Edson on the bass. Here we go, fellas. 1, 2.
As usual, our Brew's brothers are in top form tonight. Cecil, are you here to help join us in the fun?
I am.
Excellent. Oh, look who's there. How are you, Cecil?
I'm doing well. You know this guy?
No, I've never seen this guy before. Who is that in the plaid, man? He looks like he's on vacation or something.
Woohoo! You bet I am. Don't forget it.
Eric Elness, you want to introduce who you're sitting with?
Melanie will say, Eric, I thought you were on vacation. Why are you going on Darkwood Brew?
That's what I asked earlier. I said, maybe the first question ought to be, Eric, why don't you know how to take a vacation?
That's right. Yeah, not much connected with the Unhurried God. No, this is what I consider to be a wonderful vacation thing, especially to finally be able to meet up with Cecil. I think we kind of got to know each other via online chat through Darkwood Brew. Last Advent, I think he came on and like, who's this guy? He's got some really good, intelligent stuff. And you kept in the conversation when you mentioned you were going to write a newsletter article about Darkwood Brew. I thought, I'm going to check this guy out. I've checked you out. We need to have him on as a guest one of these days. He's a pretty good guy.
And here you are.
Yeah, he's been involved in civil rights efforts and LGBT equality efforts for a long time here in Portland. And he's been a member here at Ainsworth United Church of Christ for about 20 years, serving as a minister here for the last 5 or 6.
Yeah. Got that wrong. Time flies when you're having fun.
That's right. Well, I'm gonna just kind of sit back and let you guys have fun now.
Okay, we're getting a little feedback on your sound in the room. If you could just speak a little slowly, we would be able to hear you a little bit more clearly.
Okay.
Good luck with that. Yes, but it's because of the reverb and if you make a little bit of space between your words, we'll be able to get through the reverb and still be able to understand what it is you're saying. So if you could join us that way, that would be great.
Unhurried speaking.
You're speaking slowly, perfectly. Cecil, tell us a little bit about what you're doing there in Portland, Oregon. Tell us how you see God calling you through these verses of Psalm 23. Can you tell us if you see this as a calling by God into action in the world, into living into who you were created to be? And how do you do that where you are presently?
Wow, a lot of questions. But let me begin. Thank you for having me here today. Let me begin by saying when I was about 6 years old and first learning prayers, so my parents put the Lord's Prayer and Psalm 23 in our bedroom. And so what we did every night was kneel down at our bed and try to remember it. But in fact, we said one line and had to go back to the wall and read it, and come back and kneel down and pray. So it was a sort of like a hurried way to get to know God, but also a way in which the Lord's Prayer in Psalm 23 could take residence in our young hearts. So it's been a very special prayer in my life for many years, and especially as a way to calm myself down. I live a very active life, and Psalm 23 is a reminder to settle down every once in a while.
And what do you do in Portland with you're involved in the United Church of Christ there, as well as some social justice issues? And I know that you're an advocate for the LGBT community, right?
Certainly. I'm serving as the Director of Christian Ed and Youth Ministry at Ainsworth United Church of Christ. In addition to that, as you mentioned, I've been active in social justice issues for many years. I was sharing with Eric earlier that my baptism by fire here in Portland was about 25 years ago when a young Ethiopian immigrant was murdered in the streets by a group of Nazi skinheads. And that raised certainly my attention of the need to be involved in issues about how to bring people together. Shortly thereafter, in the early 1990s, there was an anti-gay ballot initiative here in Portland, in Oregon. And that was a time in which a group of religious folks began to come together to say that all people are welcome at our table. It was a way in which we began having conversations in our congregations, in our small groups, about issues that sometimes separated people. And perhaps later when we look more into the Psalm about what that means to sit down at the table with your enemy, we can explore more about that.
Yeah.
But generally, Psalm 23 is a reminder for me to live a more settled life. I had a friend who once looked at my calendar. Remember those days when we had desk calendars? And he looked at my calendar and saw all these appointments, and he said, Cecil, you have to slow down. It was a wake-up call for me to try to settle things in my own life so that I would be a more productive person as I seek justice in the world.
Well, with all the activity that you have going on, how do you make that distinction between being busy as a way to kind of distract you from listening to God versus spending some time in stillness or even in the work that you love to do, listening to the voice of God and having that voice direct you and guide you along the journey?
Well, I think it's very important. About that time when my friend told me I need to settle down, it was about that time that I began to think seriously about what is prayer in my life. About that time, I became knowledgeable about a religious order entitled the Order of Corpus Christi, which is an ecumenical Catholic religious order of women and men, and we have a religious rule and discipline. And among those disciplines includes prayer, daily prayer. For me, at least, that means praying the hours. Praying the hours, ideally 7 times a day. It doesn't always work that way. But as a way in which to settle in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, to stop, to reflect, to pray. That's a way in which I settle myself, and a way in which I settle down from the busyness of life, which all too often I got caught up with and missing the many blessings all around me.
In this Psalm 23, often I think people listen to, if they hear the very first verse, the very powerful first verse that says, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And then it continues on into the green pastures and the still waters, and people think, oh, what a nice world to live in. How great is this that God is with us in this quiet, in this calm. But what happens when we enter the darkest valley, or when we get caught up in the busyness of what we're doing, or we tend to not listen for God in the world? How do you adjust your being in the world, your activity in the world, as you move into a different phase from green pastures into darker valleys?
Yeah, it's a very, very important challenge for me, and I think for our society as a whole. I think one thing that I'm aware of, that I and maybe others have a tendency either to fight or flight, either to get in there and say, I have to do everything right now, or the world is going to go to heck. Or because there's so much to do in the world and with my family and in my community, I want to flee from all of that. I think we have to go beyond that tendency to battle constantly or to flee away. There's nothing wrong either with being in the struggle, and there's nothing wrong with time of meditation and reflection. The challenge is to balance the two of those. So for me, at least, in terms of the busyness, I think it's important to remember that God's promise is to be with us, to be with us. And for me, that means to be able to stop and be aware of God's presence. As some people say, God is all around us, but sometimes we just don't see God. And I think for me, it's helpful to settle down every once in a while during the day, reflect.
Sounds wonderful. It's a good approach. But as Phileena Hewerts was saying earlier in our highlights from last week, she was talking about how we call it spiritual practices rather than discipline, because no one really wants to do a discipline, right?
Right.
But the practices are ways for us to tune in and to listen intentionally, right, to God?
Very much so. And for me at least, it doesn't mean you have to be a spiritual heavyweight. And if something works for you for a while, let it be. If it doesn't, stop and try something else. A spiritual director once shared with me that, in my attempts to be spiritual, I try to work so hard that I lose the blessings all around me. Mm-hmm. So I need to stop and listen and see the blessings around me. And, oftentimes it's, well, no, not often. very seldom have I had an enlightening experience when I'm deep in prayer. Oftentimes I've had an enlightening experience when I'm sitting and talking with someone on the bus or on the line in the grocery store. I find God there.
So it's not only in the stillness, but also in the motion of living fully into life, huh? In the
Fully into
conversation.
life and being aware of God's presence each moment.
In the midst of all that, yeah. Well, we're going to take some time, Cecil, now to work with the text itself. We have a Numa Divina, which allows us to open up our hearts and our minds to listening for God's voice intentionally in this text, Psalm 23. So now we will begin with our second reading of the text, where we're going to ask you to listen specifically for a word or a phrase that attracts your attention. Silently repeat that word or phrase multiple times as you're listening to the thing, and see what kind of emotions or what kind of energy it brings out in you as we listen to our second reading of Psalm 23.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall flow with me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long.
In this third reading of our text, we're going to ask you to think of a question that has been nagging at you sometime this week, something that continues to rear itself up in your mind and in your thoughts, and hold that together, that question that might be nagging you, together with the word or the phrase that stuck out for you in the second reading of our text, as we listen again to Psalm 23.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long.
During this last reading of our Pneuma, we ask that you think if you are being called in any way to a specific task or a specific exercise in your life that's going to be changed as you move forward into this text. As you have your question together with the word or phrase that stuck out, what is that calling you to do in your existence, in your living out of this text and this calling from God? Think on that as we read the fourth reading of Psalm 23.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long.
This Pneuma Divina helps us to stop and listen to the voice of God. And as we're listening to that voice and how it might direct and guide us this week, we hold up questions. We hold up specific words that stick out for us. And we ask in these questions whether there are specific actions we are being called to live in our daily lives as we live out this text this week. If you are having this conversation with God and with yourself in this Pneuma, we ask that you continue to dwell on that for a bit. During our musical feature, you will have some time to just sit and dwell with these words and see if there is something that's calling you to ask for help from the Holy Spirit to help you follow through on any actions that might have come to you during this experience. And if you have not had any particular kind of action identified for you in this presence of God, then keep with it. The conversation just means that it wants to continue. There doesn't have to be a specific point or a specific significance for you as you just continue to dwell in the word and listen for God's voice. We continue with our musical feature from our Brew brothers. We're back with Cecil, who's going to join us. Tell us, Cecil, a little bit about how you celebrated the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream.
Yeah, that was a very exciting time. Here in Portland, there was a rally and a march, and people spoke, older people, and I'm really excited, younger people, thinking the struggles of the 60s with some of the issues that people face today, including immigrant rights, rights for those who are houseless, lesbian, gay, bi, trans folks, and a whole slew of issues about how to build a community. I think it's interesting because you mentioned the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And one thing that I think is important for us to know, I was doing some reading, was one, the importance of spirituality in the social justice movement, and also the importance of music as that wonderful set of musicians played. I was reminded of how important music played in the movement for the 60s. And particularly as we think of this Psalm 23, I was moved by the insight that Martin Luther King, one of his favorite psalms was the Balm in Gilead, which reads in part, "Sometimes I feel discouraged and think my work is in vain, but then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again." And also, the night before he was assassinated, he stood on that balcony and said, I want them to sing my favorite song. That song was Precious Lord. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on. Just reminder of that importance there. Even in the midst of the struggle, we can have calmness in our souls and spirits.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing to think about what it means to set a table in the presence of our enemies for people like Dr. King, who obviously had several enemies. And what does that mean for that myth of understanding that if we don't want to be busy just neglecting God or not listening to God or being distracted from God, then how do we go about living in the struggle of God? We still have to be busy. We still have to be in motion. I think the myth that not being busy means just sitting still and having no action, instead of actually being attentive to how we are active in the world by following God's activity in the world. Certainly that was true for Dr. King.
Certainly it was. And in terms of this psalm, Psalm 23, in terms of mercy and peace following us or pursuing us, as I think someone has translated, I wanted to just touch upon, again, the idea of sitting around the table with our enemies. I mentioned earlier that I was involved in lesbian, gay, bi, and trans struggle here in Oregon. And in 1992, which seems like a very long time ago, we had what became a anti-gay ballot initiative, which really divided the community among many different lines, including racial lines, gender, sexual orientation. It was a very divisive campaign, and with lots of violence involved in that. A group of us after that campaign said that, we really don't know those who are on the other side. So a group of religious folks, gays as well, but Muslims, Christians, Quakers, Jews, decided to get together and one day a month to sit in table fellowship with those who were on the opposite side of this issue. It was very painful at times, very hard, but what we discovered at those monthly gatherings was that we began to know one another, not as real people with struggles with their families. I wish I could tell you that at the end of that year and a half of meeting together, we all joined arms and sang a song. Not quite. But what happened after the end of our gatherings was that we began to see the other person who we may still disagree with on a very important issue. But we saw them as a person. They saw us as people. And we may disagree, but we found that we had to treat one another, those who are our so-called enemies, as persons valued and loved by God, as people we should value and love. Disagreements may continue. There may be times in which we are unable to sit down with someone because of real fundamental values. But I think in all times, we can look at that other person and see them as a valued child of God. They may not change, but I may change in how I view them and how I view God.
And that obviously changes the conversation that you have with them in the midst of living out what you think God is calling you to be, how you claim God in who you are, and how you act in the struggle of what it means to be alive in the world, living in the world, not just comforting us in our death, but actually using it as assurance of God as we act in the world.
Most certainly, and that means that, in the midst of the struggle, God is with us, and that we can be assured of God's presence. As Psalm 23 says, it isn't, it's a wonderful psalm to comfort us when we are alone at night, in that dark night of the soul, and we just don't know where the answer is. But it is also a psalm to empower us as we live our daily lives day by day, in the midst of our struggle with our jobs or struggling to find a job, in the midst of trying to understand our children or they trying to understand us, in the midst of trying to create a more just world. We are reminded in Psalm 23 that God is with us through it all, and we are there with one another.
And that covenant language that's used at to kind of frame this psalm, and the first one, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, has dual roles of God and us in conversation with one another, as well as the very last verse in verse 6, where we say, surely goodness and mercy shall pursue me, as you suggested, all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The pursuing is God's act of participating with us in this act of living and becoming most fully who we were created to be, as well as our action in dwelling in the house of the Lord forever. That covenantal language is that assurance of God to be with us in the green valleys, in the green pastures, the still waters, as well as in the darkest valleys. Not to turn and run away from fear, but rather to face fear and know that the assurance of God is with us.
Yeah, to face it, and I don't want to say embrace it, but acknowledge it. Acknowledge that fear, and also acknowledge that even in that fear, God is with us. Not Psalm 23, but Psalm 22, where Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it goes on to allows us to remember that God is with us. So even in our daily lives, we are reminded of God's presence in our struggle, and also in those periods of joy and comfort.
Well, we have a conversation going on online tonight. And Scott, do you have some questions from our internet community for Cecil?
Well, actually, Cecil, we have an issue that's actually come up, and we'd love to have, since we got you online here, help us out in this discernment piece. But we have a person who is supposed to celebrate a day of prayer with Muslim community as well as her own Christian community, and the Muslims are not allowing a person who is gay to be a topic of conversation in this piece, and our Christian sister or brother. I don't really know. It's a number, 293 online. But they don't know how to respond to that because their own child is gay and they have family members that are gay, and they feel that if they participate in the event, they're going to be denying their identity as somebody who lives in a loving relationship with gay and lesbian people, but on the other hand, they don't want to seem inhospitable to their Muslim neighbors. And the online community is kind of curious what you think about a situation like that, and maybe if there's some way that you can help.
Well, I think one thing that when you were sharing the questions and you said the Muslim community and the Christians, maybe some members of that community or who will be around that circle who are Muslims objected to it. But also, I think it's important for that person who has a loved one who is gay to be able to speak their truth. We may not be able to sit at the table, and that subject may be beyond the perimeters of the conversation. But I also think it's very important for that person at least to say, this is who I am. I would love to sit at this table with you. But because I love someone who is gay, because that person is important to my life, if we're unable to share that piece of my reality, perhaps I'm not able to sit at this time with you. Go in peace. But for some other people, you may just need to be there, even as a silent presence. It's very difficult, and that's a struggle that many people have, and I don't think there's any clear answer.
I thank you for that. The online community is, like I said, we've been talking about it for a while now, and it seems that all of us have the same kinds of experiences or hints that you've been giving us. I wonder for yourself then, when you think about something like Psalm 23, and you were talking so eloquently about the assurance and how this psalm has provided you with a sense of comfort. Is there a way then that the psalm also then moves you into those kind of difficult conversations that we were talking about as well? That the psalm also is not only a comfort but also a gentle nudge by the Holy Spirit to do something?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I have to go through that. I can't avoid the dark valley. So God is pushing us to go there. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemy. I have to sit at that table and be there. So it's a song of comfort, but it's also a song which reminds us to live into that comfort through a world of action. It isn't, it does comfort us, but it also reminds us that we will go through the darkest valley and we will sit in uncomfortable places with people we don't like, and God is with us there. So it's a song of comfort, but also a song of action at the same time.
Cecil, we want to thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us tonight. We are getting ready to show a video of a person who walked together with Martin Luther King Jr. in his walk from Selma to Montgomery. And he has something to say to us about this psalm and our being called into the living experience of both the green pastures and the darkest valleys as we think to this idea of Eucharist and sharing a table with our enemies. So let's listen to Tex Sample give his experience as we go. And Cecil, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope to see you online again. Yay.
Thank you so much.
And please say goodbye to Eric for us if he's still over there. Bye, Eric.
He's still there.
Have a great vacation. We'll see you all at another time soon, I hope. Let's listen to Tex Sample give his experience.
In 1965, a group of civil rights demonstrators were met at the Edmund Pettus Bridge by the police, who violently attacked them. That demonstration led Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to call for a march from Selma to Montgomery in behalf of voting rights legislation then before the U.S. Congress. So a march began from Selma to Montgomery. At the time, I was a social action executive for the Massachusetts Council of Churches. My job was to help organize and send people to that march. But I and others at the Mass Council joined the march on the day before the last day. We were driven to the site of the march after we arrived at the airport, and I spent the night on my raincoat on the ground at the St. Jude Catholic Complex. That next morning, we began that last phase of the march into Montgomery. A decision had been made that when we approached Montgomery, we would take a jog to go through the black community as a show of solidarity and support. I was on the outside and looked down the line of march, and as we were walking along, I could see an African American woman coming up the line of march, counter to our direction. She looked to be a woman who had known a lot of poverty. Her dress had been washed many 2 times. Her shoes were old and well worn. But in one hand she had a gallon jug of Kool-Aid, and in the other she had 6 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I don't know why, but when she got to me, she shoved those sandwiches into one of my hands and that gallon jug of Kool-Aid in the other. And then she looked at me and said, "Hell, brother, we're gonna overcome." Well, when I looked back up the line of march, she had gone. But I took one of those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, passed them to the person next to me in the line. Then I took that gallon jug of Kool-Aid. I was always proud that I knew how to drink from a jug. Then I handed that to the person next to me in the line, and it just hit me. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood which is shed for you and for many. That remains the most powerful Eucharistic moment of my life. I chilled for a mile after that, and we continued that march on into Montgomery. Once there, in the front of the Capitol, we began a long demonstration. And there we all sat down on the grass, thousands of us. As usual, we had singers and musicians. We had speeches. It was a rousing time together. And yet we all waited for Dr. King because we knew he would bring the message that would close out the event. Finally, the time came for Dr. King's speech. I still regard that speech in Montgomery as the equal of the one that he had made in Washington in 1963. And when Dr. King enters into the last part of that speech, he began a kind of a call and response with himself initially. He shouts out, "How long?" And he responds to himself, "Not long." How long? Not long. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because while the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. How long? Not long. And then he shouted at us, "How long?" And those thousands of people got up off the ground and on their feet and shouted back, "Not long." It would be 3 years before his body would be broken and his blood would be shed. But as long as I live, I shall never forget that wonderful black woman shoving the elements of the Eucharist into my hands and then proclaiming, "Hell, brother, we're gonna overcome."
powerful message about a Eucharist and a table along the way that is set by God in the presence of our enemies. Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, set a table and said, "This is my body, broken and given for you. Do this for the remembrance of me." And at that same table, he took the cup, gave thanks, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, shed for you and for all people. Do this for the remembrance of me." Because as often as we eat from this cup, or eat of this bread and drink from this cup, we remember that Christ is the table. That is the thing that helps us cross our differences with one another and acknowledge our common humanity with one another. And so we share this meal of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and Kool-Aid tonight as our communion feast. And we ask you to gather with us your elements and share with us in this meal that crosses all boundaries and helps us come together as a common humanity in the love of God, in the assurance that God is with us every step along the journey. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. Please join us. Yay. We thank you for joining us tonight for Darkwood Brew, and we invite you back next week when Eric will be back with us hosting Reverend Jennifer Hope Kotler. She is a spiritual director, a pastor, a retreat leader, a speaker, and a community organizer and advocate. So she has some great stories to tell us about slowing down and acting attentively in the activity of God in the world. So join us next week for another episode of Darkwood Brew on the busyness of our lives and restoring that connection to an unhurried God. And now, my friends, may the Spirit of the living God, known to us most fully through Jesus Christ our Lord, go before you to show you the way, go above you to watch over you, to go behind you to push you into places you may not necessarily go on your own, like marches on Washington, D.C., or to Montgomery, Alabama, or even into a conversation with your Muslim brothers and sisters. May God go beneath you to uphold you and to uplift you in those conversations and walk beside you to be your constant and strong companion. And may God dwell within you so that you realize you are not alone, but that you are loved, loved beyond your wildest imagination. And may the fire of God's blessing burn brightly upon you and within you, now and always. Amen.